Okay, I want to start today with James chapter 1, and I just wanted to share with you a translation I came across of a verse that I thought was good. Just when you think you've read everything, you find something else that's, it's always interesting to read different translations, I think, because it gives you a little different angle on it. I've thought a lot about the fact that there are so many translations and how different they are and how each one of them is expressive of something unique. And really it's almost as though you get an insight from God, but filtered through the humanity of the person who's doing the translation. And it's a multifaceted view of things, and it's good. They're all good. They're all interesting. This is from the Phillips translation. First let me read you the King James. This is James chapter 5. I'm sorry, 1. Sorry, Torrin. I'm making it hard for Torrin. I'm saying the wrong numbers. 1, James chapter 1, verse 5. Sorry if I told it wrong to start with. Yeah. This is a familiar verse. I'm sure you've all heard this before. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. Now, I don't know about you, but I'll just speak for myself. For me, just reading the Bible and coming across a verse like this, my natural reaction is to look at it and say, well, it's not very often that I, say, well, let's see, I need to pray for wisdom. Seems so abstract, kind of like that doesn't seem like the most pertinent thing that I might be wanting to pray for. You understand what I'm saying? But I think if we could kind of get behind the thinking of James here, and I think Phillips' translation does that. I think he gets to the heart of the matter, and I think this makes it a lot more practical. And I'm just going to read this because I don't have it on the computer. Here's the way J.B. Phillips translates it. If any of you does not know how to meet any particular problem, he has only to ask God, who gives generously to all without making anyone feel guilty, and he may be quite sure that the necessary wisdom will be given to him. Well, I like that. I think that makes it more practical. Let me read it to you again. If any does not know how to meet any particular problem. Well, that kind of encompasses everything, doesn't it? And that seems to me, that kind of hits home a little more, because we do face all kinds of particular problems. And this is what he brings out. I'm going to read it one more time. If any does not know how to meet any particular problem, he has only to ask God. And then he says, and I like how he translates this, who gives generously to all without making anyone feel guilty. Isn't that good? I think that gives us some real insight into the character of God, who gives generously, in other words, freely, to everyone, without making you feel, bad for having to have asked. I think that's a real good point there, without making anyone feel guilty. The King James says, who giveth to all liberally and upbraideth not. Upbraid, that's not part of my vocabulary usually, ever. Do you ever say upbraid? No, that's not what It means to find fault, or to criticize, or to, critique, or, to scold is a good way to say it. And see, I think sometimes that, looking at it from the point of view of our human psychology, sometimes we might feel reluctant to pray about some things because we might feel, embarrassed about it, or we don't need to feel that way. And he's just saying here, you don't need to feel reluctant at all. God's not going to find fault with you. See, I think God knows about our human condition even more than we do. He understands us better than we do ourselves, and there's no reason for any reluctance at all here. Again, I like what, instead of upbraid, Phillips' translation says, he gives to all freely without making them feel guilty. And he says, we may be quite sure that we will receive wisdom, that the necessary wisdom will be given to him. Now, again, we have what the King James says. The next verse in the King James says, but let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, for he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. This is a verse that, again, causes some anxiety for us. But I don't think it should. If we, I think the way we read this is, it makes it seem as though faith is a burden, like a tightrope act, that you can't ever waver in your faith. You can't ever have any, insecurity about it. I think the key word here is, when he's talking about faith in this verse, he says, let him ask in faith. The wavering and the not wavering has to do with the asking. I think another way to understand it is this. He's already said that God is ready to respond. And that if you face any particular problem, all he has to do is ask. And God gives freely without finding fault. I think what he's getting at in verse 6 is just the asking should be, you should have confidence that, let's put it this way. How do we understand faith? Again, I think some Christians feel like faith is a burden, some heavy weight that we have to carry, some performance that we have to perform. Here's the way I like to think about faith and believe. Believing in faith, same thing. One's a noun, one's a verb. It means the same thing. Again, I got this also from J.B. Phillips, from reading some of his writing. He said, in the context of the New Testament, what it means to believe is not so much a mental posture of assuming or fixing your mind on certain things being true, believing, embracing certain assertions. It has to do with confidence, has to do with where you place your confidence. J.B. Phillips said to believe, for instance, in Christ means that you transfer your confidence from yourself to Christ. So in this context, I think when he says, but let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, don't waver, I believe he means, are you sure you want to transfer it to him? Are you sure you want to give it to him, or do you want to keep it yourself? Are you sure you want to turn it over to him, or are you going to take it back again? I think that's what he's getting at. The wavering has to do with the asking. The asking in faith has to do with your transferring it to God instead of you carrying it. I think sometimes our worries and our problems, we treasure them, don't want to let them go. Like I heard one person say, well, if I'm not going to worry about it, who is? Well, that's just it. He is. Except he's not going to worry. He's got the answers. But you got to let go of it. You got to be willing, in other words, to let him have it and not keep taking it back again. You see, I think that's what he's getting at when he talks about this wavering here. I think what we have done sometimes in reading this is, and with our faith, we've made faith a performance. Something that we have to behave a certain way with no faults, and that makes it a heavy burden. I don't think it's meant to be a heavy burden. In fact, it's just the opposite. I think it's meant to be a relief from burdens, a release of your burdens to Him. And so that's the way I'm going to understand this. Let him have confidence in his asking. Now, there's two things I want to do to illustrate this. I want to look at some examples in the Gospels of people who came to Jesus. Of course, we can't see God, We can talk about God, of course, and here James is talking about God. And we pray and we bring our requests and our petitions to God, but we don't see Him, and that's one problem in prayer is we we can't discern with our physical senses a response. Have you ever heard people say, like, I don't feel like my prayers got any higher than the ceiling? That's just a way of saying my physical senses don't pick up the answer. Well, that's understandable, because you are sitting here in a physical body and praying with your physical mouth out of your physical mind. God's a spirit. But Jesus is the manifestation of God in a physical body, in a human form. Again, Jesus said to his disciples at the Last Supper, when one of them said, "Show us the Father and we'll be satisfied," he said, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." Paul said he is the manifestation of the Godhead bodily. When we see Jesus in the Gospels, we see God in action. And so we might say, we can gauge how God responds to petitions by looking at how Jesus responds to petitions. And I think we'll notice two things. I want to look at two sides of this. The petitioner, or the person who comes with the need or the request. And James, like he says here, let him ask in faith, the asking in confidence. In other words, the confidence that I'm giving it to you, I know that you can do it. In other words, that's how I'm going to define faith in this context. Let's just see if that bears out. I want to see two sides of it, the people who come and then the response from Jesus. Now, the first place I want to look is in Matthew chapter 8. And by doing this, I think we can understand the attitude, at least, the mindset, or the way God looks at things by seeing how Jesus looks at things. I'm just going to start reading with the first verse. This is a great chapter, by the way. Matthew chapter 8, verse 1 says, "When he was come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, there came a leper and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean." Now, in one way of interpreting what James said, you might say that this is a doubt. But I don't think it is. I don't think this is doubt. I don't think this man's wavering at all. In fact, he seems confident, doesn't he? Does he seem confident? His confidence is that if you're willing, you can. That's what he's saying. He seems, in other words, he's asking in confidence, isn't he? Even though he expresses some uncertainty about what his will is, but he says, if you will, you can. If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. Now look at his response. Jesus put forth his hand and touched him, said, I will. We could understand that that's what God's attitude is when we come to him. Before the words almost out of his mouth, he says, I will. This is a good illustration, I think, of what James said in Phillips' translation. He gives to everyone freely and doesn't make anyone feel guilty. And he's right, and that's right about God too. If you will, if you're willing, you can. Well, he can, and he is willing. Jesus put forth his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, See thou tell no man, but go thy way and show thyself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a testimony unto them. The priests in the temple, and the high priest and the leaders, those were the people who didn't really believe in Jesus. And he says, in the law it says on the day that a leper is cleansed, here's what he does. And he goes into the temple and makes an offering. And he says, go do that, and that will be it will be evidence or testimony to them. Verse 5, when Jesus was entered into Capernaum, there came unto him a centurion beseeching him. It's interesting here that the word beseeching, again, not part of our vocabulary, in the Greek language, this is the same word that's elsewhere translates pray. So I think it's interesting. Pray just means to ask. He's beseeching him. He's praying. So this is a good example. And here's his prayer, verse 6. Lord, my servant lies at home, sick of the palsy, grievously tormented. Before he can say any more, Jesus responds, verse 7. Jesus said, I'll come and heal him. I think we can see the attitude of God here. It's certainly the attitude of Jesus. I doubt if they have different points of view about it. I think they're expressing exactly the same point of view. In other words, the man came with his request, and the answer immediately, I will, just like he said with the leper. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I'm not worthy that thou shouldest come under my roof. Now, we don't know what he was thinking when he said that, but that's a common, reaction that many people have. They don't feel worthy. But on the other hand, nobody's really worthy. We're all flawed in some respects. We all have things that would ordinarily disqualify us. But when Jesus came into the world, he brought to us the grace of God, the unmerited favor of God. So worthiness or unworthiness doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't enter into the picture. But this man nevertheless said, I'm not worthy that thou shouldest come under my roof. But speak the word only, and my servant shall be healed. He has great confidence, doesn't he? For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to this man, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he doeth it. When Jesus heard it, he marveled, and said unto them that followed, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. He's commenting on this man's confidence. What I see, in the context of what we've been talking about, this man is ready and willing to turn the whole thing over to Jesus. Did you see that? He said, you speak the word and it'll be done. In other words, I'm not going to hold on to it, I'm giving it to you. I'd say this is a good example of a person who is asking faith, nothing wavering. He doesn't try to take it back. He doesn't say, well, hold on a minute here. I think I'll worry about my servant a few more days. And I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. Verse 11 says, and I say unto you that many shall come from the east and the west, and shall sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the children of the kingdom shall be cast into outer darkness, and there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, once again, I've commented on this many times, and you probably know what I'm going to say, but just for the benefit of anybody that might be watching this video on YouTube, and I hate to pass over without responding to it, because I know it troubles some people. And I know the devil's sneaky and dirty, and he'll take a verse like this to make people feel scared. He's not talking about Christians here. When he says the children of the kingdom, he's talking about the people he is there speaking and ministering to. You can see from the context that he said, I haven't found so great faith in Israel. Those are the children of the kingdom that he's talking about. And what he's saying here is, when he says many shall come from the east and the west, he's saying that many Gentiles, outsiders, who under the old covenant would have been outsiders, they're going to come from all over the world, and they're going to believe just like the centurion. But those who should have been, those who are the insiders who should be believing, because they're not, they're going to find themselves on the outside. Outer darkness means on the outside. That's always the language that's used in the prophets in the Old Testament to speak of the Gentiles. They sit in outer darkness. That's what he's saying here, is that there's going to come a reversal of position. Elsewhere in the Gospels, he said it this way, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And it all has to do with, are you willing to place your faith in him? And those, John said it this way, he came unto his own and his own received him not. He's talking about the first century nation of Israel, who were his own. He came as the last prophet of the Old Testament. And they, unfortunately, except for a few, did not receive him. And unfortunately, to use his language, the roles reversed themselves, and those who believed in him, even though they came from far away, like this centurion, who were not insiders, who were not Jews, who were not part of the nation of Israel, because they believed, they found themselves in the company of those who did believe, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And those who didn't believe, even though they were racially and ethnically connected to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through blood, found themselves spiritually excluded. But they don't have to stay excluded. If they'll believe, they can be on the inside too. So that's all those verses mean. So, verse 13, and Jesus said unto the centurion, go thy way, as thou hast believed, so be it done unto thee. Again, I'm understanding believing not as a performance, not as some kind of magic trick that we perform, not as some kind of act of our will, but as simply turning it over to Him. A transference of our confidence from ourselves to Him. A refusal to carry it anymore myself and give it completely to Him. And that's what he did. That was his believing. And as he believed, so it was done to him. And his servant was healed in that self-same hour. Let's go on reading. And when Jesus was come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother laid sick of a fever. And he touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she arose and ministered unto them. We see here the gracious, giving, freely attitude of Jesus. He saw the need, and he just reached out and gave her what she needed. Let's go on reading. And when the evening was come, they brought unto him many that were possessed with devils. And he cast out the spirits with his word and healed 50%. No. All. Isn't that an amazing word? Every time I see that word, it amazes me. It's a universal word, isn't it? Well, if nothing else, this tells us God's attitude. This tells us at least the attitude of Jesus. He's not willing that any should suffer, that any should be excluded, that any should have anything of the kind. He cast out the spirits with his word and healed all that were sick. And here's why, verse 17, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah. That's the way Isaiah is written in the Greek language. And by the way, in case you don't know, the reason that in the Gospels these Old Testament prophets are spelled a different way, it's because in the first century of Israel, they were using a Greek translation of the Old Testament. It's called the Septuagint, and that was the one they were most familiar with. Greek, because Alexander the Great conquered the Middle East and clear over to India many years before, he established the Greek language as the language of discourse and commerce. And so the Old Testament scriptures, what we call the Old Testament scriptures, what people in Israel just considered the scriptures, what they were familiar with was these Greek translations called the Septuagint. And so in Greek, Isaiah comes out as Isaias, and that's why the prophets come out that way. Anyway, Isaiah is how we understand it, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Himself took our infirmities and bare our sicknesses. Now this is a quote from Isaiah 53, in which the King James translation says, He carried our griefs, He took our griefs and carried our sorrows, which I like that too, but literally the words are having to do with our physical infirmities. He took them. And the free granting of that kind of relief is because He took them. There's an exchange. You know, that's why we can transfer our confidence from ourselves to Him, because He's transferred everything wrong with us to Him as well. He's already made an exchange here. He took our infirmities. He bare our sicknesses. Let's turn the page over to chapter 9 just for a second. I think chapter 9 is good too. There's so many good things here. He entered into a ship in verse 1 and passed over and came into his own city. And behold, they brought a man sick of the palsy and lying on a bed. And Jesus, seeing his faith, said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, be of good cheer, thy sins are forgiven thee. You see how free he is in distributing and giving the grace of God. And behold, certain of the scribes said within themselves, This man blasphemeth. And Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, Wherefore think ye evil in your hearts? Which is easier, to say, Thy sins be forgiven, or to say, Arise and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has the power on earth to forgive sins. Then he said to the sick of the palsy, Arise, take up thy bed, and go into thy house. And he arose and departed to his house. Again, this is an illustration of what James says. He freely gives to everyone and doesn't make anyone feel guilty. Now, evidently, here was a case where a man could have been made to feel guilty. We don't know why. We don't need to know why. Evidently, I just trust that when Jesus says something or does something, he knows what he's doing. When he said to this man, thy sins are forgiven, I'm sure that probably meant something very profound and significant to that man. But you know what? He'd say the same thing to you and me too. Just in case that's a problem for any one of us. Hey, we can all look at our lives and say, I should have done this different back here, and I should have done that different back there. None of that matters, I think we put way too big a stock in our choices we've made in the past. I think we put way, way, way too much importance and emphasis on that. There's many roads to get to the right outcome. I sometimes think of it like this. I don't know if you understand this. Well, I think I can make it. If I say tree, you can visualize a tree, can't you? Yeah. Can you see a tree in your mind? Let's just say that your life is like a tree. And let's just say God has decreed for your life, let's just picture a tree. It's going to be like this tree, and that's God's plan. And your life is going to be like, let's just say, like this tree. Now, when you look at a tree, you can take all the individual branches and you can rearrange the individual branches in an infinite variety of ways, but it's still basically the same tree, isn't it? It's still a tree, isn't it? I see all those like if you're drawing a tree or painting a tree, it almost doesn't matter which way you go on the different branches. It's still going to come out and be the tree. And your life is like that. My life is like that. God has, He sees our life from beginning to end, and all the individual choices we make along the way are like the little tiny branches in the tree. They're big to us, but in the overall picture of things, it's still going to come out. He's still the master painter. It's still going to be a beautiful tree. Even if we might, we look and say, well, I should have put that branch on the left side instead of the right side. From his point of view, none of that matters. And especially in the matter of guilt, we should never feel guilt about anything. It's a big obstacle. And so Jesus said to this man, we don't know why, your sins are forgiven. So he says, which is easier? To say your sins are forgiven or to say rise up and walk? Because he's given them both away freely. Did you notice that? So he arose and went to his house. And when the multitude saw it, they marveled and glorified God, which had given such power unto men, meaning Jesus. Now here's another good account here in chapter 9. I like this one. Verse 27. When Jesus departed thence, 2 blind men followed him, crying and saying, Thou Son of David, have mercy on us. And when he was come into the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said unto him, Believe ye that I'm able to do this? It's interesting. Before ever doing anything else, he asked them, Are you willing to believe? Do you believe? This reminds me of what I read from James a while ago. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. You know what, I'm kind of going to read into this a little bit and say, let's just reword it. I'm going to dare to paraphrase this. When he says, believe ye that I'm able to do this, I'm going to say it this way, are you willing to give me this and let me do it, or do you want to keep it? They've been blind a long way. They probably were beggars. That probably was part of their income. I don't know if you've ever encountered people like that that are, looking for handouts, and I've seen a lot of them in, when I lived in Boston, for instance, people who are performing music on the sidewalk, and I did that a little while myself. I had in Boston Commons, had my little battery-powered amplifier, and I never made much money at all. But I noticed there was this guy outside of a record store, and he was evidently blind. But you know what? I don't know if he was or not. But he had dark glasses on, and he sure acted like he was blind. And that guy raked in money hand over fist because people felt sorry for him. So what I see in this is when Jesus says, do you believe I'm able to do this? It's like saying, are you willing? Are you willing to transfer your confidence from yourself to me? Are you ready to give it up? And you might think, well, why not? But he's asking, why would he ask them that? Believe, well, evidently that had something to do with it, I presume. Believe ye that I'm able to do this? And they said, Yes. And he touched their eyes and said, According to your faith, be it unto you. And their eyes were opened, and Jesus straightly charged them, saying, Let no man know it. Let's see. Let's do one more, and then I think I'm done. There's so many stories like this in the Gospels, and they're all really encouraging, I think. Because the people that came to Jesus, they didn't have to perform. They didn't have to. Basically, all they came was all they did was they came to Him and brought what they had to Him, and He fixed it. And I think that's the essence of it. We bring what we have to Him. We don't have to figure it out. We don't have to understand it. We just have to be willing to let Him do it and give it to Him. I think He knows how to fix everything. I just kind of have that view of it. I don't think there's anything too hard or too beyond or too difficult. I just think He's got all the answers. That's why James said, if anyone has a situation that you don't know how to deal with it, all he has to do is ask. And God gives freely and doesn't find fault. He doesn't make anyone feel guilty. This is in Mark chapter 5, verse 21. When Jesus was passed over again by ship unto the other side, much people gathered unto Him, and He was near to the sea. And behold, there cometh one of the rulers of the synagogue, a man named Jairus by name, and when he saw Him, he fell at His feet, and besought Him greatly, saying, My little daughter lieth at the point of death. I pray Thee, come and lay Thy hands on her, that she may be healed, and she shall live. So this guy, he had it all visualized in his mind. Evidently, he'd been thinking a lot about this, and in his mind's eye, he imagined Jesus coming to the house and laying His hands on his daughter and fixing the situation. Evidently, he'd heard about Jesus. We can only presume that, but that's what he said. Please come and lay your hands on her. She shall be healed and live. And Jesus went with him. Now, it doesn't say all this, but what's implied is He went with him so that He could lay hands on her so that she could be healed and she could live, because that's what He asked him to do. So, He didn't say, come back tomorrow. He didn't say, well, I'm kind of busy right now. He didn't say, well, reluctance whatsoever. Freely willing to give. And this is, of course, expressing the personality of God. Jesus went with Him. Much people followed Him and thronged Him. And a certain woman which had an issue of blood, meaning bleeding, for 12 years, and suffered many things of many physicians. Now, I'm not down on doctors, and of course, we're fixing to have one in the family, Phil's studying medicine. But it's possible to, doctors can't do, they're not miracle, they're not magicians. They're not God. And they do the best they can, but sometimes the best they can doesn't get the job done. And I think that's what this is saying, is the case here. She'd suffered many things of many physicians and spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse. Well, I'm sure she felt like she was in a hopeless situation. Nevertheless, when she heard of Jesus, verse 27, when she heard of Jesus, that's the beautiful thing about it. Everybody in any kind of situation, when we mix Jesus into the picture, there's hope. When she heard of Jesus, she came in the press behind. Press means people pressing in, and touched His garment. For she said, if I may touch but His clothes, I shall be whole. Now Jairus, in his mind, he imagined Jesus coming and laying His hands on his daughter, and she would live, and so that's why Jesus was going with him, because that's what he believed about it. And this woman said, if I may touch but His clothes, that's what she imagined. She imagined herself in the crowd touching His clothes, and because of the virtue and the power that was in Him, she would receive what she needed. And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. And Jesus immediately, knowing in Himself that virtue, that means power, had gone out of Him, He could sense that power had gone out. He turned Him about in the press, in the crowd, and said, who touched my clothes? He could feel it. He could tell, but he didn't know who did it. And, I know this troubles some people whose theology is that he weighs in on every person, and this one he helps, and this one he doesn't help. One thing we find out about God if you read in the New Testament is he's no respecter of persons. Everybody is treated alike. Everybody is he freely gives to all. And so people who have that idea that he picks and chooses, they can't understand why Jesus said this. Who touched my... They also think, well, Jesus knows everything. And when he was walking around in a human body, he didn't know everything necessarily. So I think when he said, who touched my clothes, he asked because he really didn't know. He felt power, but he didn't know who touched him. And the disciples said, you see the multitude thronging thee, and sayest thou, who touched me? He asked because he didn't know. And he said, you see, everybody's touching you. Everybody's touching you. But one person touched him and believed something. You see, we don't have to go somewhere and find his clothes and touch them, but we touch him when we pray. We do. We touch him in exactly the same way when we pray. Everybody was touching him, but somebody touched him believing something. And he looked around to see her that had done this thing. And the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him and told him all the truth. I guess she thought she was in trouble. I guess she thought she wasn't supposed to have done that. But you know what we read in James? He gives freely to everyone, and he never makes anyone feel guilty. Here was a woman who, it says, trembling. She was scared, afraid she might have done something she wasn't supposed to do. But notice how Jesus relieves her sense of insecurity and fear. He says in verse 34, he said unto her, daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. In other words, you dared to transfer your confidence from yourself to me. You dared to put this into my hands. That was her faith. She reached out to him with her faith. Notice he didn't say, my clothes made you whole. Your faith. And even though we don't have access to his clothes, we have faith. And if her faith made her whole, I believe our faith makes us whole. And daughter, thy faith has made you whole. Go in peace and be whole. He pronounced a blessing on her, relieved her of any sense of anxiety or fear. Meanwhile, Jairus, who said, come and lay your hands on my daughter that she may live, he's standing there tapping his foot on the floor, saying, looking at his watch, saying, what about my daughter? While you're fooling around with this woman here, what about my daughter? While he yet spake, there came from the ruler of this is verse 35, the ruler of the synagogue's house, certain which said, thy daughter is dead, why trouble the master any further? Well, it looks like a bad situation. As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, you see, this is a discouraging word. And in our lives, I think often, we do our best to believe God and to place our faith in him the best way we know how. Sometimes discouraging things happen in all kinds of realms. It's not just having to do with our physical situations, but in circumstances, in relationships, in jobs, and everything that has to do with our lives, there are disappointments. And here was a disappointing word. But when Jesus heard it, the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, be not afraid, only believe. You notice how Jesus keeps recentering the mind of the person he's dealing with into a channel of faith or confidence. Keep your trust in me. Be not afraid, only believe. I think this applies to us in everything that confronts us. Any kind of unfortunate or disappointing circumstance, he would say, if we could hear him, don't be afraid. He says, only believe. I did some study on these words, only believe. In the Greek language, There's different tenses of words. There's a past tense, a present tense, and a present tense that's active, and so forth. Literally, what I found by looking this up is literally, when he says only believe in the King James translation, literally the best translation would be to say be believing, as a state of being. Be believing. Be not afraid, but be believing. Here's what a scholar named Kenneth Wiest said about it. The verb tense suggests continuous action. Just keep on, in other words. So that's his response to this man who received a discouraging report. Don't be afraid, just keep on trusting in me. And he suffered no man to follow him, save Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. These are his inner circle here. People of the disciples, these are the ones he had the most confidence in, evidently. And he cometh to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and seeth the tumult, and them that wept and wailed greatly. And when he was come in, he saith unto them, Why make ye this ado and weep? The damsel is not dead, but sleepeth. You know, for Jesus, there's no closed doors. You ever notice that? He never does say, well, I guess we're out of luck here, folks. Do you ever read that in the Gospels? You ever find a place where Jesus says, I guess we're out of luck? You know, too bad. I've never seen that anywhere in the Gospels. There's no closed doors for him. Why make you this ado and weep? The damsel's not dead. He just sees things differently than we see them. Sleeps. And they laughed him to scorn. And when he had put them all out, he taketh the father and mother of the damsel and them that were with him, and entereth in where the damsel was lying. And he took the damsel by the hand and said to her, Talitha cumi. Now we talked about how the Old Testament prophets are sometimes spelled differently. That's because they read from a scripture that was in the Greek language. When you see words like this, it's because it's really complicated. They had the scriptures written in Greek, but they spoke in their everyday dialect in something called the Aramaic language, which was kind of a Semitic language. And so sometimes when he says particular phrases, the translator just put those exact words in there. Talitha cumi, that's Aramaic, which is being interpreted, Damsel, I say unto thee, arise. And straightway the damsel arose and walked, and she was of the age of 12 years, and they were astonished with great astonishment. Well, I imagine they were. And he charged them straitly that no man should know it, and commanded that something should be given her to eat. I guess he thought, she's been laying here, she must be pretty hungry by now. Anyway, he's concerned about that as well. Okay, I think that's all we got. Let's all stand up today.